Okay, so let's see. Last but not least, in this part at least of the presentations, we have Lauren Bennett. If you would like to come up here, Lauren, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss AI through an equity lens. Please take it away, Lauren. The stage is yours.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lauren. I think I face a similar challenge that my colleagues have faced, which is that this is a ridiculous topic to cover in 10 minutes. So I guess, and particularly because equity is so important, I feel like it's important for me to say that what I want to say is a tiny piece of a much bigger discussion that I hope we're going to have a lot more of over the next 2 days, and it's going to be imperfect and incomplete by its very nature. I think that we're all really acutely aware that we're facing these massive challenges, and I want to start by kind of acknowledging that while we are facing these globally, that while we're facing these globally, that not everybody is being impacted by them equally. And so we really have to think about the disproportionate ways that certain communities are being impacted by these, yes, very global challenges that we're facing. I would be remiss as a geographer, this is my bias, if I didn't bring up kind of the value that thinking spatially about these problems brings us, very much because it can be that connective thread that brings all of these pieces together. What I was thinking while I was watching Carl's presentation and how economics and ecology mirror each other in some ways, I was thinking, yes, and also that we need to model them somehow simultaneously. And so all the complexities of this and all of the complexities of that all have to come together. And so, I see geography as this kind of uniting field that can help us do that. And it's really another lens to think about that through. I want to kind of frame this using these guiding values that were spearheaded by a colleague of mine, Clinton Johnson, who runs our racial equity and social justice team at Esri, and is also he's right now on loan to NAACP as their vice president of geo equity innovation, which is pretty cool. He's an amazing guy. And these guiding values we're working on really around the idea that our work needs to be intersectional and spatial, that it needs to be community and justice centered, that it has to have at its foundation equity and inclusion, and that it needs to really reinforce accountability and transparency. I'm going to dig extremely quickly into each of those things. So on the spatial side of thing, I'm going to say the most ridiculously simple thing, but we need to map our data. The amount of times I watch AI projects happen without ever looking at the data on a map is shocking. And something as simple as understanding where your missing data is can sometimes, if it's really randomly spatially distributed, okay, sure, we'll throw out the data, we'll fill it in with an average. Maybe we'll do something really smart like fill it in with a spatial average of its neighbors instead of just a global average. But if we see that it's really clustered, probably we don't want to throw that data out. Probably we don't want to fill it in. Probably we want to go back to the source and understand why is there a problem in our data collection. And so something as simple as just mapping our data is critical for understanding what we're training these models with. On the intersectional side of things, I could talk about just this slide all day. I want to talk a little bit about this idea that a lot of the data that we're putting into these models are actually outcomes, not root causes. And so what we get into is we are training models with what's happened, but not with how we got there. And so it doesn't know how we got there, why we got there. It just knows where we are. And there's a lot of challenge there. So really bringing in things like redlining that allow us to understand why we're seeing the outcomes that we're seeing, and making sure we're bringing in data that reflects those root causes is really, really important. We also have to bring in really deeply disaggregated data. We need to understand how policies that we're making impact people of different identities from marginalized communities. So we want to be evaluating our inputs, thinking about, is our training data representative spatially? Is it representative of all of these systemically marginalized identities? We also want to be evaluating our outputs. This is a really important piece where in the conversations about equity and AI, we are always talking about inputs, but the outputs and this idea, asking the question of ourselves if our model and if our proposed solutions are actually going to maintain or even exacerbate existing inequities is a really important question that we need to be constantly asking ourselves. This is an example of a paper that came out in Nature this year around the spatial distribution of OpenStreetMap building data in urban areas, and looking at this, and this is data often used to train models to detect buildings, but not shockingly, it's much more complete in rich urban areas. And so any model that comes out of it is going to do a better job in rich urban areas, probably the places we need it the least. And so we really need to be thinking about that. If one thing I really wanted to talk about is this: the questions that we ask really matter. This idea, I'm using the term objective function kind of philosophically here, but the questions that we ask determine the objective function. What is our model trying to solve for? In agriculture and forestry and renewable energy, a really common practice is looking at this concept of highest and best use for a parcel of land. Will we get the most bang for our buck with solar or with wind or with carbon sequestration? But the highest and best use kind of implies that there is an objective highest and best use. Best according to who, right? And on what? Is it about saving money? Is it about, and who benefits from that highest and best use? The questions that we're asking are not neutral. And if we don't have equity built into our questions, it's not magically going to appear. What we will do is we will perpetuate systems of oppression and systems of marginalization over and over again because we're not asking the right questions. And so it's really, really important that we ask these questions. And there are lots of folks doing that, right? Oh, that's very light on the screen for some reason. Okay, sorry. So this is an example of some research we did with a really awesome lab at Harvard run by a woman named Francesca Dominici, who's often asking questions about equity. This one related to air pollution. Air pollution is getting better, but actually mostly for rich white people, and the disparity is growing. This is an example from LA, the city of LA, where they're trying to green the city, but they're asking inherently from the beginning about how we do that equitably. So we can ask these non-neutral questions in ways that actually benefit marginalized communities and have that equity lens. So the way that we can ask some of these questions is probably going to start with making sure we've got the right people at the table to help us ask the right questions, right? This means that we have the right people at the table and that they're not just at the table and that they don't just have a voice, but that they have actual power to help us make those decisions. And a lot of it's going to involve that community co-creation. If we're talking about urban heat, someone who's actually experienced that is going to ask different questions than somebody that hasn't. And so we have to be listening to these very diverse voices across race and ethnicity and gender and from different disciplines, bringing these questions together to help us ask the right questions. For accountability and transparency, I'm actually using an example from NatureServe, so a throwback to this morning. I think they just do a beautiful job building trust and legitimacy by making sure that they're communicating with all sorts of different audiences. You have to communicate, of course, with researchers so that your research is reproducible and transparent, but you also have to do a really good job of telling compelling stories. I think that's one of our biggest challenges as a scientific community, is taking the time to do the work to really communicate what we've done effectively. It's like the final mile of the marathon, and way too often we're like, no, but my science is great. And so that speaks for itself, but it doesn't speak for itself. And because of this explosion of AI, we all know, I feel like I'm seeing decision makers won't even act if an algorithm didn't tell them to. Like it's like we're now so obsessed with the idea that it has to be data driven. And what that can mean is that they're now being bombarded with information products. And we love the idea that it's the best science that's being used to drive decisions, but oftentimes it's the sexiest story. And so we have to combine our great science with really good storytelling if we want to make a real impact. So I will finish with some calls to action around these points. We have to be interrogating our data spatially, intersectionally. We need to include equity in our model objectives. It has to be at the foundation of the questions that we're asking. We have to empower people with marginalized identities, bring them to the table, and help everybody help us ask these questions. And we have to commit for these insights really getting to everybody, so that the actual action on the ground can happen. And that is my nutshell on equity and AI.
Great presentation, very inspiring. Actually, it's not a question, it's an add-on, it's a comment. So you've presented such a nice narrative from the perspective of data. I like to bring another dimension when we come to equity and when we come to justice, and this is from the point of view of the Global South, specifically Africa. When we look at climate, we run the risk of further exacerbating the digital divide. Why? Because the compute resource required for running AI models on climate data is so heavy and so hungry that you need HPC, high performance computing. As I speak, that doesn't exist in the continent. And so there is a big gap when it comes to infrastructure. I would just posit to this group that infrastructure is climate justice, and it's time to act.
Yes.
So I wanted to refer to your comment about the map of buildings, and you were showing from OpenStreetMap it is not complete. But from satellite imagery, you can actually look, find every single building, and it has been done for US. This was a DARPA project 5 years ago, and Oak Ridge has done that. So here is something AI can do for you. Buildings, cars, these things are visible in satellite imageries, and that's something AI can help you complete very quickly.
Okay, so the comment was that, computer vision is quite good at detecting buildings, but I would say that, I don't think it's as good as we think it is. It is still not complete. And I bring up the OSM because we still have to train those models to find buildings. And what's a building? A building in New York City is different than a building in sub-Saharan Africa. And so these models, while they are very helpful, and I completely agree, we have to be very aware of how we're training them and where we're still likely to not be doing as good of a job as in other places.